homestead west of Garden City, Kansas, the fall of 1935. A woman named Della Kirkham walks the pasture behind her house with her two youngest children and a canvas sack apiece, bending every few steps to pick up something flat, dry, and gray off the grass and toss it in the bag. The same steady rhythm her own mother had taught her before she could properly walk a straight line. By sundown, the three of them have filled a wagon bed with enough fuel to heat the house clean through December, gathered for free off ground that belonged to nobody in particular. Her own grandmother had done the exact same walk on this same stretch of prairie 60 years earlier, back when the animals leaving those chips behind were buffalo instead of cattle. Here's the twist, friend. Della's grandchildren never learned to walk that pasture at all, and neither did most of ours. Not because the skill stopped working, because somewhere in the space of 2 generations, the whole country decided a skill like that one wasn't worth passing down anymore. I'm Amos Whitfield, 5th generation on Whitfield land between Kansas and Nebraska. My grandfather Homer copied a great deal of what follows into a leather journal he kept from 1934 until the year he died, and he made me promise the old ways wouldn't die out quietly on my watch. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we spend our time exactly here, pulling this kind of knowledge back into daylight before the last person who actually did it by hand is gone. Number 9 on this count is a piece of clothing that turned an entire generation of farm children into walking advertisements, without anybody minding much. Number 3 is a rope stronger than anything you could buy at a hardware store, made from a plant most folks walk past without a second look. 25 counted down, from the smallest of these skills to the one underneath all the others. Let's start with the fuel that kept an entire treeless country warm for the better part of a century. Number 25, cow chip and buffalo chip fuel. Dried dung, gathered off open pasture and burned clean, was the primary heating and cooking fuel across most of the treeless plains for decades before coal or gas ever reached these counties, and there was even a rough science to picking the good ones, mature chips that had dried slow and hard in the sun, burning far longer than anything gathered too soon off wet spring grass. Properly dried, it burned nearly odorless with an intense, steady heat, and it cost a family nothing but the walk to gather it. Buffalo herds thinned to almost nothing by the 1880s, and families simply switched to cow chips without missing a beat, since the fuel worked exactly the same regardless of which animal produced it. Railroads brought coal within reach of most plains towns by the early 20th century, and a fuel a family had to walk out and gather by hand started to look old-fashioned next to one you could order by the ton and have delivered. The physics never changed. The chip still burns exactly the way it always did. It just stopped being anybody's first choice once there was something to sell instead. Number 24, the twisted hay stove. When even cow chips ran short in the leanest years, prairie families burned the one thing that never once ran out on the Great Plains: the grass itself. Loose hay burned too fast and too cool to be much use, so families twisted it tight into dense ropes, sometimes with a hand-cranked machine patented as early as 1876 out of the Dakota Territory, and fed those twists into specially designed hay-burning stoves that held a steady, concentrated heat far longer than loose grass ever could. It took constant tending, a family member feeding the stove every few minutes through a long winter night. It also meant a family with nothing else on hand was never truly out of fuel, not on ground that grew hay by the thousands of acres for free every single summer. Number 23, the wet sheet in the doorway. Long before the Red Cross ever handed out a single gauze mask, prairie households were already hanging damp sheets and quilts across doorways and windows during a dust blow, letting the wet fabric catch the heaviest grit out of the air moving through the house. It bought a family cleaner air inside 4 walls during the worst of a storm, at the cost of nothing but the wash water already sitting in the basin. The practice faded less from any single cause and more from simple forgetting, as fewer households needed to run the drill once the worst storm years finally passed, and screened, sealed windows became standard on newer homes built after the decade ended. Number 22. Newspaper and rag window sealing. Between storms, a family stuffed torn rag strips and folded newspaper into every gap around a window frame or door jamb, sealing out the fine dust that worked its way through the smallest crack in a house built cheap and fast on a homestead claim. It was ugly, and it worked, holding back a measurable amount of grit for the cost of yesterday's paper and a rag bag that was going to get used for something anyway. Modern weather stripping replaced it after the war, sold as tidier and more permanent, and it is. But a strip of rag in a window frame still does the same basic job today that it did in 1935 for the same price of exactly nothing. Number 21. Sod and hay wall insulation. A dugout or sod house packed its walls thick with prairie sod and loose hay, both of which trap dead air remarkably well, and held a house at a steadier temperature through brutal summer heat and equally brutal winter cold than a thin frame wall ever could on its own. It cost a family nothing beyond the labor of cutting and stacking the sod itself, sod that was, after all, already lying right there under their feet. Framed and sided houses came to be seen as the mark of having arrived, of having left the soddy behind for good, and the insulating value of a 1.5 foot of packed earth got traded for the appearance of prosperity more than any real gain in comfort. First pattern break, friend. Everything so far cost a family nothing but labor and a willingness to bend over and pick something up off the ground. What's coming next moved into the kitchen, where the old knowledge ran even deeper. Number 20. Ice harvesting and sawdust storage. Come January, a family with access to a frozen pond or slough-cut blocks of ice with a handsaw hauled them to a shaded ice house dug half into a hillside for good measure and packed them tight in sawdust, which insulated well enough to keep those blocks solid clear through the following August in a good ice house, sometimes with enough left over to sell a block or two to a neighbor who hadn't cut as much. It gave a family cold storage through the hottest months of the year for the cost of one hard week's work in the dead of winter. Electric refrigeration reached most towns well before it reached the more remote farms, and by the time it did arrive everywhere, the ice house had already been quietly written off as something only a family without better options still bothered to keep. Number 19. Coffee from the garden, not the store. Real coffee cost real cash money. A Dust Bowl household rarely had spare, so plenty of families roasted and ground chicory root, barley, or dandelion root instead, brewing a dark, bitter drink that stretched a family's actual coffee supply for weeks, or replaced it outright when there was none to be had. It cost whatever was already growing in the yard. Once the economy turned and real coffee became affordable and plentiful again after the war, the substitute quietly dropped out of most kitchens, remembered mostly as something a grandmother mentioned once and nobody thought to ask more about. Number 18. The sourdough crock kept alive. A jar of flour and water, fed a little more of both every few days, kept a wild culture of yeast alive indefinitely, without ever once requiring a trip to the store for a fresh packet. And a family that kept theirs going could trace the same starter back through years, sometimes generations, of unbroken use. Commercial yeast, cheap and reliable and sold in a neat little packet, made the whole ritual of feeding a crock every few days feel like more trouble than it was worth to most households by the middle of the century. Number 17. Butter churned by hand. A dasher churn and 15 minutes of steady work turned cream skimmed off the top of the morning's milk into butter, with buttermilk left over as a genuine byproduct, not a waste product used for everything from biscuits to a tenderizing marinade. Commercial creameries centralized butter production through the early 20th century, and a stick wrapped in wax paper at the store looked like less trouble than 15 minutes at a churn, even though the churned butter never cost a household anything beyond the milk they already had. Number 16. Fermented vegetables in a crock. A family with a good cabbage crop and a stoneware crock could turn a single harvest into sauerkraut that kept through an entire winter without any canning equipment at all. Just salt, thyme, and a weighted lid holding everything under its own brine. It cost nothing beyond the salt itself, and the process actually improved the nutritional value of the vegetable rather than degrading it. Commercial canned sauerkraut, cheap and shelf-stable and requiring no crock taking up floor space, made the slower fermented version feel unnecessary to a generation that had a grocery store within driving distance for the first time in family memory. Second pattern break. From here down, friend, we move from the kitchen into the field and the sewing room, where some of the cleverest tricks on this whole list were hiding in plain sight. Number 15. Lye hominy from field corn. A family boiled dried field corn in water treated with wood ash lye, which loosened the tough outer hull and transformed the kernel into hominy, a staple that stretched a corn harvest into an entirely different food than the corn itself could otherwise become. The process, borrowed originally from native agricultural knowledge going back centuries, cost nothing but ash a family was already sweeping out of the stove. Canned hominy on a grocery shelf eventually made the whole slow, smoky kitchen process feel like an unnecessary chore for a food you could simply buy already finished. Number 14. Prairie turnip and wild onion foraging. Long before a homestead's first crop ever came in, the ground itself was already growing food. Prairie turnip dug from the root, wild onion pulled straight out of a low spot in the pasture. Both of it knowledge passed down originally from the native peoples who had eaten off this exact ground for thousands of years before a single sod house went up. It cost a family nothing but the knowing, which fewer people carried with each passing decade as store-bought produce became the default, and a family stopped needing to look at the ground under its own boots as a pantry. Number 13. Chokecherry and wild plum preserving. Wild chokecherries and plums grew thick along creek bottoms and fence lines across the plains, free for anyone willing to pick them. And a family that knew how to cook the tannic bitterness out of a chokecherry turned a scrubby wild fruit into jelly, syrup, and a wine that kept for years. Commercial jam, cheap and consistent and requiring no knowledge of which wild fruit was safe to pick and which wasn't, slowly replaced a skill that had once been common enough that every farm wife on a section knew exactly which creek bend had the sweetest bushes. Number 12. Corn husk baskets and dolls. Nothing on a farm went to waste if a family could help it, and the papery husk stripped off every single ear of corn at harvest time got woven into baskets, mats, and simple dolls for children who had no money for anything bought. It cost nothing beyond the time to weave it, time a family had plenty of during a long winter evening. Plastic and manufactured toys, cheap and widely available after the war, made a homemade husk doll look like a mark of poverty rather than a mark of skill. And the weaving itself faded out of most households within a single generation. Number 11. Flour sack clothing. A 100-pound sack of flour or chicken feed came wrapped in plain cotton fabric, and a resourceful mother could turn 2 or 3 matching sacks into a genuine dress, shirt, or set of curtains for the cost of the flour she was already buying anyway. Matching the prints across several sacks bought over a few weeks so the finished garment didn't look pieced together at all. Milling companies noticed the trend fast, and rather than fight it, they leaned all the way in, printing their sacks in bright patterns by the mid-1930s specifically so women would choose one brand's flour over another based on which print she wanted for her next dress. Some even publishing pattern booklets to keep the whole thing fashionable. That's one of the rare items on this whole list where a company didn't bury the old skill. They saw it coming and got in front of it instead, which is its own kind of lesson. Third pattern break, friend. The next stretch is where the household economy runs straight into the workshop, and where making do stopped being optional and started being the only option there was. Number 10. Corn shuck mattress ticking. A mattress ticking stuffed with the dried corn shucks instead of store-bought cotton batting slept a family through a hot Kansas summer more comfortably than you might expect, the loose shucks allowing air to move through in a way a solid stuffing never could, and it cost nothing beyond the harvest a family already brought in every fall. Manufactured mattresses, softer and more uniform, became the mark of a household that had made it, and the shuck ticking got relegated to the back bedroom, and then, before long, to nobody's memory at all. Number 9. Feather beds from your own geese. A family that kept geese plucked soft down feathers a few times a year without harming the bird, saving them up over seasons until there was enough to fill a proper feather tick that would outlast the family that made it, sometimes getting handed down as a wedding gift to the next generation. It cost nothing beyond the geese a family was already keeping for meat and eggs regardless. Manufactured bedding, standardized and available by mail order through any catalog, made the years-long patience of building a feather bed from scratch feel like more effort than a modern household had any reason to spend. Number 8. Darning instead of discarding. A wooden darning egg, a needle, and a length of matching yarn turned a worn heel or a torn elbow back into a sock or a shirt that had years of life left in it. A skill every child on a farm learned early because a family simply did not throw away anything that could still be mended. It cost nothing beyond a few minutes, and thread already in the sewing basket. Cheap, mass-produced clothing after the war made buying new feel more efficient than mending old, and a skill that had once been basic household literacy slipped quietly out of most families within 2 generations. Number 7. Tire rubber resoling. When a family's last pair of decent shoes finally wore through at the sole and there wasn't a spare dollar for a new pair anywhere in the house, a worn-out inner tube or a strip cut from an old tire made a surprisingly durable replacement sole, cut to shape and tacked or glued on at home. It cost whatever scrap rubber a family already had lying around the yard. Cheap manufactured shoes after the war made the whole practice look like a hardship nobody wanted to be reminded of, rather than the clever bit of engineering it actually was. Number 6. Harness leather repaired with beeswax thread. A cracked strap or a torn trace on a work harness got stitched back together with waxed linen thread, the beeswax coating keeping the thread from rotting in the weather the way plain thread would, a skill that kept a $2 harness working for another decade instead of forcing a family to buy new. Tractors slowly replaced horse teams across the plains through the 30s and 40s, and the whole skill of harness repair faded out along with the animals it had always been meant for, taking a genuinely useful bit of leather work down with it for no better reason than the horse itself had gone out of style. 4th pattern break. The last stretch, friend. Everything from here down is knowledge that ran quieter than the rest, the kind that didn't need a tool or a recipe, just a sharp eye and a willingness to pay attention. Number 5. Fence posts, treated with used oil. A cedar or Osage orange fence post soaked in used motor oil or old crankcase drainings before it ever went into the ground resisted rot for years longer than an untreated post would, stretching a fence line's working life considerably for the cost of oil a family was already draining out of the tractor anyway. Commercial pressure-treated lumber, standardized and guaranteed, eventually made the old bucket and brush method look primitive, even though plenty of hand-treated posts from that era are still standing in a fence line somewhere on this very stretch of prairie today. Number 4. The barn cat and the barn owl. A family that kept a working barn cat and left an owl box or a quiet rafter undisturbed for a barn owl to nest in controlled the mice and rats that would otherwise have gotten into stored grain at no cost beyond leaving the animals be. Chemical rodenticides, sold as faster and more thorough, became the modern answer starting in the middle of the century, and a genuinely effective, entirely free pest control system got quietly replaced by something a family had to keep buying every season instead. Number 3. Yucca fiber cordage. The tough, fibrous leaves of the yucca plant, common across the drier stretches of the plains, could be pounded, scraped, and twisted into a cord stronger and more weather-resistant than a good deal of what you could buy at a hardware store. A piece of native plant knowledge that plenty of homesteading families picked up and kept using for everything from repairs to harness work. Manufactured rope and twine, cheap and consistent, made the slow work of processing yucca fiber by hand feel like an unnecessary skill for anyone who could simply order a coil of the real thing from a catalog. Number 2. Reading the sky before it turned. Long before radio forecasts reached every farmhouse, a family survived by watching the specific color a cloud bank turned before a real storm arrived, feeling the sudden drop in temperature that came minutes ahead of a serious blow, and listening to how the birds and the livestock behaved in the hour before trouble showed up on the horizon. It cost nothing but attention. paid close and consistently over years of living on the same stretch of ground. Radio and later television forecasting made that kind of close, personal attention to your own particular sky feel unnecessary, even though no broadcast tower has ever known your own back pasture the way 3 generations of watching it could. Number 1 is not a skill, friend. It's what all 24 of the others were quietly teaching a family the whole time. Every single item on this count costs nothing but attention, patience, and a willingness to bend down and pick something up off the ground instead of driving into town for it. That is not deprivation, and it was never really about having no other choice, even in years when that was mostly true. It is a kind of literacy, reading your own land closely enough that it kept handing you what you needed, season after season, without you ever having to ask twice. Homer's journal has a line from 1939 that I think about more than almost anything else in that whole book. He wrote, "We were never poor out here, not the way town folks meant it. We just paid for everything with our own 2 hands instead of money." That's the whole list in one sentence, friend. Della Kirkham walking that pasture with a sack in each hand wasn't scraping by. She was fluent in something most of us have simply never been taught to read. Comment down below and tell me which of these 25 your own grandparents actually did, not just heard about, actually did with their own hands. I read every single one, and the skill that shows up most often in the comments is the one I go deep on in the next video. Pick one thing off this count and try it yourself this week, however small it looks written down. Twist a rope of hay and see how long it holds together. Darn one sock instead of throwing it in the bin. That is the whole trick 25 times over, boiled down to its root. Next time on this channel, I'll walk you through the 2-cent trick that kept a whole county's seed corn alive through a drought the extension office swore could not be beaten, and the exact year the hybrid seed companies made sure nobody would ever need to remember it again. I'm Amos Whitfield, and thank you kindly for listening.